Good morning, it's Ryan from Old School Automotive again, and today we're working on the 7.3 liter Powerstroke. We got a couple of rubber fuel return lines that are leaking. Let me show you what we got going on. Well, the first thing to mention that anybody who's worked on an old body style 7.3 liter would notice immediately is that we are not running a factory fuel system. This truck has been converted to e-fuel, and we've deleted the fuel bowl, the factory fuel bowl, which normally would sit right in here. And it's got now frame-mounted spin-on type fuel filters and a frame-mounted electric style pump. However, you can see this little dealie right here. This is the factory fuel pressure regulator. You can go online and Google the tightwad mod. This is a free way of reusing the factory fuel pressure regulator when you go to an electric fuel system. I actually pieced this system together myself, going from the factory fuel feed line. You can see we use a compression union to go to a 45-degree elbow, hose barb, high pressure fuel hose, and then from there down to another hose barb which leads into a brass T, and a couple of fittings to lead to, I believe they're 5/16 brake line, and from there each of the hard lines then goes to the cylinder heads to feed. Once the fuel feeds through the cylinder heads, it returns in the factory style direction and goes into the fuel pressure regulator, and then excess fuel is returned via this return line to the fuel tank. But as you can see down here in the valley, we've got some diesel. That's not cool. So what's been going on is these rubber return lines, you can see they're quite damp, and while they haven't completely ruptured, they are spongy with fuel. I can just you can see the fuel squeezing out of it just like a sponge. So these things are done, and we're going to replace these with a set from RiffRaff Diesel. Got these pretty reasonably priced, 30-35 bucks a piece, made in USA. So the passenger side one should be pretty easy. It just runs down from the fuel pressure regulator down to the cylinder head over here on a fitting right there. But the driver's side is down in behind the AC compressor. So we're not gonna remove the AC compressor, but we're gonna unbolt it and set it out of the way so that we can then move the bracket, get that out of the way. And in order to do that, we're gonna have to pull the belt. So let's get started on that. Using a 15mm socket and a ratchet, release the tension on the belt tensioner and move the belt out of the way. Remove all the electrical plugs for the AC compressor, then use a 10mm socket and a ratchet to remove the bolts holding it into place and set it aside. Next, you're going to need a 13mm socket to loosen the bracket that mounts the AC compressor, power steering pump, and the vacuum pump. We need to move that out of the way in order to be able to access the fitting on the cylinder head that the fuel line mounts to. Set the AC wiring harness out of the way so you can have better access to work. Continue removing the 13mm bolts and get the bracket moved out of the way so you can access the fitting on the cylinder head. Now, using a 7/16 wrench to hold the fitting on the fuel pressure regulator and a 9/16 wrench, you can loosen the old fuel hose fitting and remove it completely. Replace it with a new RiffRaff hose. Always start them finger tight and finish up with the wrench. In this case, I took a tip from another YouTube mechanic, and I added a little dab of dielectric grease on the threads. According to this other guy, the dielectric grease eases the installation, keeps it from corroding in place, and just generally makes for a better install. You want to be careful you don't add too much that it contaminates your fuel. Just a touch to lubricate the threads, and I did find that helped the installation. Continue replacing the fuel hoses until you've got all 4 of the fittings finger tight. Once you've got them finger tight, you can torque them down with your 9/16 wrench. You want to get them pretty snug. You don't want any fuel leaks here. Once the fittings are completely tight, go ahead and replace the convoluted tubing that protects the fuel lines from chafing. I opted to replace mine because the old ones were just fuel soaked and greasy and nasty, and I had some sitting on the shelf. Now you can see I've got paper towels. I'm mopping up in the engine valley, cleaning up all that old fuel so we have a nice dry, clean engine valley to look for leaks. As soon as we put fuel pressure back to the system, we want to be able to make sure there's nothing leaking. Okay, we got the old hoses off, got the new hoses on, everything's tightened down. Now, if you had a factory fuel system with a mechanical fuel pump, this is where you just continue buttoning everything up, and once it's all back together, you start it and check for leaks. Now, the electric fuel system that I have has the advantage where we can jump with the fuel pump right now. We can check for leaks before we go ahead and bolt everything else up. So I'm going to do that right now. I've got a lead that runs from my starter solenoid down to the fuel pump so that the fuel pump is energized during cranking. And I'm just going to take a jumper clip and put that on there and connect the other end to 12 volt positive. Bubbling, that's the air that was in the lines purged out. Sounds like all the air is purged. It's nice and dry down at the driver's side head. It's good up here. Fuel pressure regulator. And I don't see any leaks down on the passenger side head. And in all cases, we have cleaned up the engine valley, so if there's any future leaks, we're going to see it. Basically, over the next couple days, I'm going to monitor, because these hoses were just seeping fuel. It wasn't an obvious burst hose. It wasn't like spraying fuel out all over the place. It was just kind of a slow, steady leak. I'm pretty sure it was these hoses because of how spongy and dry rotted they were. In fact, let's take a look at that right now. But it is possible fuel is leaking from another location. But at any rate, these hoses definitely need replacement. Look how dry rotted this one is, and I'm pretty sure that's going to be a big part of our leak right there. And just as you flex these hoses, squeeze this fuel right out of the rubber. These things were seeping fuel at the very least. And over here, I don't know if this is in focus or not, but same thing. It's the longer hose from the driver's side. It's pretty well at it. So these need replacement anyway. And hopefully this was the only cause of our leak, because it definitely was causing some leakage. But I'm going to go ahead, turn off the fuel pump now, reconnect the relay the way it's supposed to be connected, and I'm going to continue buttoning the engine back up. Alright, first off, we're going to use a couple zip ties to replace the ones that we cut off that held the wire harness in place. Next up, we're going to be replacing the AC compressor. The AC compressor has a couple of locating dowels that center it on the bracket. Makes it real easy to drop those bolts back in once it's in place. Of course, first we have to finish tightening up all those 13mm bolts that hold it onto the cylinder head. Put the bolts in finger tight, and then use a torque wrench to tighten to 17 to 23 inch-pounds. In my case, I just use the educated elbow because I've done this enough times. But just remember, you don't want to crank down on them too hard because they're fairly long and skinny. You can twist them off. Then I had to use a zip tie to hold the AC wiring pigtail in place because the locking clip broke. Then simply replace the belt, and we're ready to test fire. Okay, we've got everything buttoned back up. Get the belt routed, factory specifications. Looks like everything is buttoned back up. Back up. Doing a final check. Tighten that up. This plug you might have seen me messing with. It's for the air conditioner, and the little clip that holds it in place is broken. So just wrapping a zip tie around the bottom and then a zip tie around the top removable part, We'll secure that in place so it doesn't vibrate off. But looks like everything is hooked back up. I don't see any tools that I've left. Tools have been moved back out here. The radiator support. Go ahead and start this up. We should be good to go. Well, there you have it. We replaced the leaky old fuel return hoses with some brand new ones from RiffRaff Diesel. We cleaned up the engine valley, we checked for leaks, everything looks good to go. Our elapsed time was only about an hour and a half for the whole project, and that's mostly just because it's not hard, it's just hard to get at some of the fittings. You gotta get in there and move some other stuff out of the way. But now the only thing left is the worst part of any project, the cleanup. Hope you've enjoyed watching. Hope you learned a little something. And if this is doing any good for you, please like and subscribe. It sure makes things better for me. You can always unsubscribe later if you want to. Thanks. See you later.